My name is Isabella Banos. I'll be reading my pro-constructive, followed by my con-constructive, the resolution being that the United States federal government should ban corporate acquisition of single-family residences. I'll be starting with my pro. My time starts my first word. I affirm the resolution. Contention 1, comparative sales rise. Harvard 20 states that comps determine the price of a home by looking at prices that similar properties have been sold at. Harvard 23 explains that the share of SFRs purchased by investors rose as homeownership house purchases fell. Investors purchased 30% of single-family homes in 2025, worsening the already limited inventory of homes for sale. Vintner 26 explains that those purchases raised prices for would-be occupants. In the Sun Belt and in the Midwest, corporate concentration of SFRs exceeds 30%, and institutional buyers pay higher prices for homes, thus increasing the comparable prices in said areas. Reserve 25 explains that raising housing prices price families out of home ownership, and lower income households are likely to have their mortgage applications denied and pay more for housing costs than they do for anything else. Corporations increase the comps of SFRs, especially in low income neighborhoods where residents can't keep up. Impact health. Unstable housing conditions cause negative side effects to health. Human Rights 24 explains that stable housing and health conditions and overall well-being and most services such as healthcare and schools are linked to residential status. HMC 24 explains that renters who faced eviction experience excessively high mortality rates compared to other groups. Housing impacts health and can worsen health disparities if it becomes more expensive. For example, Healthcare 24 explains that cancer is a leading cause of death in older unhoused adults. Residents struggling with housing had poorer survival after cancer diagnosis compared with those who were continuously housed. Corporations increase comparative sales concentrated in low-income areas, causing adverse impacts on people's health. Contention 2, residential recession. Corporations put home ownership out of reach for families. Carly 24 explains that by 2030, institutions are expected to own 7.6 million homes, accounting for almost half of all SFR units in the entire country. NHG 25 explains that the U.S. has a shortage of 7.1 million rental homes affordable and available for renters with low incomes. Corporations exacerbate this issue. HUD US 23 explains that investors can outbid homeowners with all-cash offers, lowering the availability of homes for purchase and raising prices of the remaining homes. Inflated prices push out families, so families can't afford housing. ZOW 25 explains that 75% of U.S. households are unable to afford a median-priced household in 2025. CNBC 26 explains that homeownership and wealth go hand in hand in the United States. Not being able to afford a home hinders the family's chance of growing wealth. Perry 23 explains that investor activity caused a 1.4% drop in homeownership rates in the United States. For reference, 87 million Americans own homes, meaning that 1.2 million lost theirs. Richardson 26 explains that 22 million renter households spent over 50% of their income on housing. Renting is hard and corporations make it harder. Wild 24 shows that investors raise rent prices 60% higher than the average renter. The impact is discrimination. Companies purposefully pick low-income neighborhoods. ACG 25 explains that corporate landlords are twice more likely to buy homes in African American neighborhoods than white communities, disproportionately affecting Black and brown communities. Corporations invest mostly in SFRs in areas where prices are lowest, and those neighborhoods are mostly Black and Hispanic. This stagnates homeownership in marginalized communities. SFR acquisition is high in Atlanta. ACG 25 states that the homeownership for white people in Atlanta has hovered around 80%, but for Black owners, that rate is only 45%. Desmos 25 explains that the racial wealth gap is wide and is predicted to continue expanding. Gage 25 explains that Black people have lost more than $4 billion in home equity in a 10-year period because of investors, and that's in values that would have gone to individual home buyers if it hadn't been for large investment firms purchasing those properties. NRC 25 states that Seattle lost 25% of Black residents due to gentrification in 2010 to 2020, at the same time that corporate acquisition rose in that area. Medina 19 states that raising housing costs causes displacement of families, forcing them into worse neighborhoods. Redline communities lack resources like healthy food, high quality, and healthcare. They have a 4.8 higher probability of experiencing violent crimes, and it turns into a cycle. Griot 23 explains that once you start changing in terms of where people get to live, it has an impact for generations down. CFR 22 explains that inequality fosters political dysfunction, and concentrated income and wealth reduces the level of demand in the economy. Thus, I strongly urge you to vote pro. My time for my con case begins on my first word. Contention 1, housing shortage. Corporations are not the root problem. The issue at hand is the lack of inventory. Pinpoint 26 explains that institutional investors represent only 1 to 2% of the housing market, and their activity isn't the driver of rising housing prices or inventory shortages. The biggest culprits are inflation, zoning regulations, and limiting new construction. Banning corporations would resist and restrict housing supply and increase housing costs. Alio 26 explains that housing prices were rising before institutional investors even became a talking point. Housing supply failed to keep pace with population. Corporations are actually helping housing supply. FU 25 states that investors purchase SFRs and reimburse forgotten properties to rent them out to households that can't afford to buy such home otherwise. Landers 22 explains that by 2030, investors are expected to own more homes than they do today and account for a higher percentage of SFR units in the country. Voting a con allows corporations to aid the shortage and help incipient neighborhoods improve services due to better funding. Impact public funding. Property tax is the main funding source for public services. ITAP 24 explains that local governments collect around $800 billion in taxes every year, and property taxes account for 72% of this revenue. Muirfield 23 states that property taxes rose in neighborhoods which investment firms purchase real estate. Corporations take the burden of higher taxes to contribute to more resources. Johansson 24 laments that big investors help build a greater supply of rental options that enable families to move into neighborhoods with higher education and better economic outcomes in areas where they otherwise may not be able to afford. Corporations help rent to people in areas where they can't afford, giving them a chance at building wealth. Impact 2, real estate market. Corporations purchase in economic downturns when individuals can't, stabilizing the market when needed. Federal Bank 24 explains that during the Great Recession, institutional buyers stepped up their purchase of single-family houses to provide rental homes and to moderate the drop. Corporations have the ability to keep the market afloat during harsher economic conditions. Hudson 19 informs that institutional investors improve the housing market by reducing vacancy, lowering unemployment rates, and shortening the time that distressed properties stay in REO. It overall provides safety against fire sale collapses. C2 investments suffer. Corporations are currently helping the economy. Muirfield 23 explains that home values rebound quicker in neighborhoods where institutional investors are active. Corporation landlords that buy SFRs are structured as REITs backed by investors who buy REIT shares. Coletti 25 explains that REITs buy homes in low-rung neighborhoods, and REIT growth increases housing supply. Lambert 26 explains that a corporation, Amherst, serves more than 200,000 residents, 85% of whom would not qualify to live in the homes that they live in today without corporations. Corporations' investment is crucial to aid lower families and give them fair opportunities. Funari 24 explains that 50% of American households are invested in REIT stocks in 2023, and Nariat 25 states that U.S. REITs have a market capitalization of $1.4 trillion. A majority of REITs are SFRs. If the ban goes into effect, Resolution Capital 26 informs that a negative signal sent to the investment community limits future investment and causes stock market drops in a big sector like that. Nayugan 26 shows that President Trump's announcement to ban corporate acquisition triggered a 6% drop in INVH's stock. Even the mention of a ban deters investors. A large-scale disaster will happen in the stock market if the ban takes place. The impact is quality of life due to recession. March 25 explains that a severe stock market crash triggers economic recession, economic hardship, social unrest, mass unemployment, and political instability. Coase 26 explains that the last recession led to declines in investment and a sharp increase in unemployment. So will this one. Genres 23 states that becoming unemployed leads to stress, which can worsen an individual's health, and it leads to coping strategies including alcohol-related health problems and illicit drug use and illicit drug dependence, where the body becomes used to the substance. And when desperation takes over families, it prompts them to dangerous coping mechanisms, which would only further prolong their needs, and desperation causes a likelihood of dangerous coping mechanisms. Thus, I strongly urge you to vote con. Thank you.